The Archipelagic and Island States Forum is a platform designed to facilitate 47 archipelagic and island nations to collaborate and cooperate in addressing common challenges in four thematic areas: climate change mitigation and adaptation, blue economy, marine plastic debris, and good maritime governance. In 2017, the idea to establish the multinational cooperation framework among the archipelagic and island states was first iterated during the UN Ocean Conference in New York. In November 2018, Indonesia hosted the first ministerial meeting with 21 archipelagic and island states. The Archipelagic and Island States Forum was established by Manando Joint Declaration. In the following year, the second ministerial meeting adopted the final outcome with 25 AIS participating countries. To achieve our vision, we focus on four objectives which we translate into our programs: create an open, innovative, and engaging forum, provide a space to share and implement innovative and tangible programs, promote collaborative efforts among stakeholders, and create opportunity through the blue economy. Ideation, implementation, and evaluation are the core elements to our solution framework in addressing the problems. In 2020, AIS Forum launched programs to drive innovation, which are AIS Joint Research, a collaborative applied research program affiliated with academic institutions in AIS countries with various topics related to the four areas of collaboration. The Innovator Scholarship Program, a fully funded exchange program for talented individuals from AIS participating countries who can demonstrate exceptional leadership quality and creative mind, and AIS Innovation Challenge, to find innovative ideas and breakthroughs that can help societies and businesses to be more resilient and adaptive during crisis situations. AIS Forum also launched AIS Blue Startup Hub, a platform to connect marine-focused startup in 47 archipelagic and island states across the globe. AIS Blue Startup Hub Mentoring Program was launched with 18 participating startups from 6 countries. As an effort to realize the smart, innovative solutions, AIS Forum also engaged with public audiences through online events in a form of trainings, workshops, talk shows, and discussions with various topics and stakeholders across AIS participating countries. In light of COVID-19 pandemic, it is important for archipelagic and island states to have a resilient economy. Therefore, AIS Forum Secretariat introduces programs which focuses on blue economy. As a form of its commitment, AIS Forum developed Blue Economy Development Index, or BEDI. This index will be used as a tracking tool to determine the current use of coastal and marine resources, and it can be used as a tool to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Blue Financing Framework, or BFF, which provides a guidance for governments, financial institutions, philanthropists, and donors to align their investments with the blue economy principles and allow them to select a project to be financed in the blue economy sectors. Smart and innovative solution programs, such as sharing knowledge sessions with experts and representatives from AIS participating countries. Plankton, which was a competition to raise awareness in reducing marine plastic debris. Impact pitching, which connects startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, potential investors, and growth enablers to gain partnership. And Ending Plastic Pollution Innovation Challenge, which was a collaboration with Marine Plastic Debris Project from UNDP Indonesia to address marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. Many solutions to challenges that affect AIS participating countries in 4 main thematic areas and SDG 14 goals are produced through collaboration programs. These programs will explore opportunities through innovation and experiment that benefits on a local, regional, and international scale through sharing knowledge and experiences between AIS participating countries.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And welcome to the webinar on sea level rise and its impact on states' boundaries, the case of the archipelagic and island countries. This event is organized by the Archipelagic and Island States Forum, the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime Affairs and Investment, and also the UNDP. And this webinar is also a part of the side event of the Archipelagic and Island States Forum Ministerial meeting. My name is Gusman Siswandi. I'm from Pajajaran University, Faculty of Law in Bandung, Indonesia. I would like to say thank you to the AIS Forum and also the UNDP as well as the coordinating Ministry for Maritime Affairs and Investment for having me as a moderator on this event. I would also like to welcome representatives from the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime Investment Affairs, government institutions, and also academic institutions, as well as representatives of embassies of AIS countries. And of course, also welcome all the participants. We have quite an international mix this morning, this afternoon, this evening. We have participants registered from Singapore, China, Australia, Malta, UK, Ireland, Denmark, and also Sweden. So ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege for us to have these speakers, prominent speakers. I would like to welcome all of them. His Excellency Ambassador Arif Hafaz Ugroseno, Professor Ronan Long, Professor Clive Schofield, Mr. Vinay Narayan, and also Mr. Kushal Raj. Thank you very much for joining us in this very lovely morning, afternoon, and evening. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start the session, please allow me to introduce a little bit about the topic that we are going to discuss today. So as you know, the issue of climate change in the ocean has been very important lately, and it has been gaining international attention, especially in terms of sea level rise. We know that there is a report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, especially in 2019. There's a special report on ocean and cryosphere in changing climate. And the report basically confirms that there is so-called present and future danger with respect to sea level rise, that it will rise between zero point 0.3 meter to 1 meter by the end of century if we don't take any actions in mitigating climate change. Our focus for today is actually to discuss how this sea level rise may affect the application of baseline and maritime zones, and at the end of the day, of course, the state's boundaries. This is an area where it is still uncertain and unsettled under international law. There have been a number of fora to discuss this issue. For instance, at the United Nations Informal and Consultative Process of Law on Law of the Sea, the 21st meeting, it dedicated the meeting to discuss sea level rise and its impacts. And we know there is also the International Law Association committees, one on the international law and sea level rise, and the other one on baselines under international law. The issue has been also put into the agenda of the International Law Commission. And as I mentioned earlier, this is still an unsettled area under international law. And I think we're going to have a very, very interesting and insightful discussion for today. So without further ado, I will um, move to our first speaker, for our first panelist for today, Mr. His Excellency Ambassador Arif Hafaz Ugroseno. He's Indonesian ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, and he was also a chief negotiator for maritime boundary treaties between Indonesia and its neighboring countries. He was also an ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia to um, to Belgium, and he was also the Director General for Law and International Treaties at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He he obtained his education at Harvard Law School in 1992 and from Faculty of Law at Diponegoro University in 1986. Ambassador Hafaz, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chatur, Pak Gusman. Very good morning to my colleague here in Europe, Professor Long, Ronan, Professor Dr. Schofield, Clive, and also for my colleagues in the other end of the world in Fiji, Dr. Raju and Vinarayai, and of course, colleague in Indonesia in Jakarta, and colleague who have also following this webinar from many different parts of the world. What Pak Gusman said, Dr. Chatur said, it's very true. It's an issue that has no solutions, if you say, in international law yet. There are discussions in many different forum, and I think I would say this is the first time at the AIS forum that we discuss this matter, and I hope this will not be the first and the last one. It will be actually the initial discussions at the AIS forum. I have a presentation in PDF. It's 25 pages, but I will skip through most of the presentation. I will share with you later on so you can consult the presentations at the later stage. Now, can you see the PDF form, yeah? Okay.
Yes, it's okay.
Now,
Please.
yeah, so we structured the outlines into basically this structural thinking. And I think the point number 4 would be very interesting one, some crazy ideas that I want to share with you. Whether you will agree or not in the future, let's see what happens. So this is just a reference on the IPCC assessment, as Pak Gusman mentioned. We all believe that, we are not denier. This is the reason why it's rising so fast. If you look from the year 2000 and to in this year, and also in the predictions to 2100, there are many aspects of that. Melting of the glaciers, the Greenland ice sheets melting, Antarctic ice sheet melting, land water storage, thermal expansion, all this scientific evidence that we have seen it. This is many different cities around the world, from New York, Venice, Germany, China, Fiji, Africa, Argentina, Sydney. So across the world, you see the evidence that rising sea level is going up. So no doubt about it. Now this is in Indonesia. Now for our colleague in the Pacific, if you think that the rising of sea level only affects you, I think you should look at Indonesia as well. This is a part of the northern Java. This is the coastal area of the central Java on the northern side. This area has been inundated from the sea. the sea is going up, the rising of sea level goes up, this community has been relocated. Okay, and the northern part of Java, the stretch of 750 kilometers, we have the rising of sea level in different dimensions. Some is only uh, 1 meter or so. Some is already gone quite high, like in this space in area. This is a photo of the people who try to fight it with putting mangrove, but it's too late. And this is some of the picture of that previous picture before, and they have to relocate this area. This is a place that was left, and this is a mosque in the northern part of Jakarta. So you don't have to go that far. So I think colleague from the coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs, when you do a meeting on the rising of sea level with a colleague from the Pacific, you can bring them to northern part of Jakarta, and this is what you will see. So it is not a phenomena that affect only island states or small state, but it also affect country as big as Indonesia with many island, thousands and islands across Indonesia. This is, of course, the analysis of the impact. You can have a look at later on. Now, this in relations to the maritime zones. You consult UNCLOS Article 3, Article 33, Article 57, Article 76, article that relates to the breadth of territorial sea, contiguous zone, EEZ, and continental shelf. They all refer to baselines from which the projections of the territorial sea, contiguous zone, EEZ, and continental shelves are being made from. So the question then, if the sea is rising and the baseline that you're using are not representing the actual fact, then would that mean you have to reduce your territorial sea, inward looking, inward interactions, and as well as the other projections of the waters that you have, at the sea. Whether you outer limit, then we have to go inside or not. So this is the legal question, because the baselines are not or cannot be used anymore because of the rising of sea level. This is one thinking. The baseline, of course, if you know, it's a low water line along the coast. There's a straight baseline, and also there is archipelagic baseline. Again, the impact is very clear geographically. If you have the rising of sea level, then the low water line along the coast will, of course, be moved inward looking, and the straight baseline, if the points that you use to connect the straight baseline are also impacted inside, then of course it may have to move inside. And for archipelagic states, for countries like Indonesia and Fiji, the impact may be more than just readjusting the baseline inward. I'll give you a map here. There you go. For us, archipelagic states, Indonesia and Fiji, we have to follow the mathematical rules in UNCLOS. And the rule is very clear. The land and water ratio is 1:1 and 9:1. And what if we have some features or island are completely submerged? Then if the ratio is not the same as required by the UNCLOS, then countries like us, Indonesia and Fiji, we will not become archipelagic state anymore. And then the implications, of course, will be very, very, very deep because it reflects on many different aspects of the waters in and around of the archipelago itself. Thus, the impact is very clear. The moving of normal baseline inward, the moving of locations of points adjoining straight baseline also going inward. So this is the challenge that we face. And if you look at this chart that you see in many different analysis of sea projections, then if the baseline is moving inside, then logically people say that the rest of the zonation will also move inside. Now, what is the response of the countries? Okay, to be frank, many coastal countries policymakers are neither aware, or have conclude any responses that are needed. To be frank, before I left Indonesia for Berlin, we have an internal discussions. Some colleagues from certain ministries are aware, some are not that aware. And it's very problematic, I would say, because we are the largest archipelagic state in the world. We have a lot of stakes. We were leader in the establishment of many principles of UNCLOS, and we are not yet aware of this recent development. Now, also to be frank, the rising sea level that has happened in Indonesia now mostly happened in northern part of Java Island, and I have not seen, at least personally or professionally, any rising of sea levels in the area where we have our baseline with our neighboring countries, or baseline towards the Indian Ocean or the northern part of the Pacific. So I would say so far we are safe, but we never know. And looking at the trajectory of the climate change, the impact of the rising sea level, maybe it's just a question of time when we will start to see some of our coastlines where we have our neighbors or Indian Oceans or the Pacific as a basis for our maritime projections will or may be affected. Now, there are some countries, especially in the Pacific, maybe colleague from Fiji later on can also chip in on the discussions. We have some coastal countries who have taken steps individually and as a group. Okay, we have all these groupings there. The Polynesian states and territories, Pacific countries, party to the Nauru Agreement, the PIF, and Marshall Islands. State responses from Polynesia states and territories, they have a political statement, and it's very interesting that in the statement they mentioned that the territories that they have and the sea is calculated according to emerged lands and permanently establish the baseline in accordance with UNCLOS without taking into account sea level rise. So we are looking at political statements to create a permanent baseline regardless of the rising of sea level. Also, we look at Pacific countries, their party Nauru Agreement. Again, they have the same approach, permanent baseline, remain in perpetuity irrespective of the impact of sea level rise. PIF, same thing. You can have a look at the specific statement later on, but the same thing, same approach. And Marshall Island, Kiribati, and Tuvalu have all enacted new legislation which are basically creating a permanent baseline system, fixed geographic coordinates. From the UN system, maybe later on, Ranan and Clive will explain a little bit about the work of the ILC, but it's still on a very preliminary stages. They are looking at practices, they are looking at the treaties, there are question of for instance, if the treaty is already signed for, say, between Indonesia and Australia, or Indonesia and Singapore, or Indonesia and Malaysia, what happened to the treaty on the boundary? And the discussion between many international lawyers are that the treaty that's been signed will stay on forever, regardless of the rising of sea level. But those who are without treaties are still under a lot of interesting discussion. These are just a repetition that I took from the ILC documents about the relevant materials that could be submitted to them. In this regard, AIS could also supply informations on their decision or discussions to the ILC, to give the ILC an idea that, you know, countries across the world, archipelagic and island states, are actually looking at these questions also very, very seriously. Um, the international law thinkers, we have the Sydney Conference of the ILA, International Law Associations, also publish a report, and they have an approach of freezing existing baseline, which I think is problematic because there are some countries who are having excessive baselines. Our country who creates non-existent baseline in South China Sea. I mean, that's on my own theory. And all countries who create the outer limit of the base of the maritime zones. Now, if we go to the conventional law of the sea, all right, the fact that it was negotiated for a rather long time and negotiated by many different interests. We all understand that UNCLOS is basically results of balance of interests between all states. And one of the important aspects is that even the landlocked states have their interests taken care of. Of course, you have all the different articles that landlocked states have to work with the coastal states or states that have access to the sea, but the rights of landlocked states are very clear. If it even has a freedom of navigations, we have many landlocked states in Europe. Of course, they have flags flying of their vessels, so it's a very unique convention because the interests of all states are being taken care of. So even landlocked states are being taken care of in terms of their interests. What about landlocked countries? I mean, this is I created this term, you know, mimicking a landlocked state and landlocked countries. What if the right of landlocked countries actually, you know, should be taken care of as well in the context of a new norm for disappearing islands? Because we have seen countries are making political declarations and signing agreements on fixing permanent boundaries, but at some point, if the countries are all submerged, the reality kicks in, and you cannot live there anymore. But I think the right of the landlocked countries need also to be looked after by international conventions. I believe that thinking about the rights that previously exist in the land and in the internal waters or the territorial waters, contiguous zone, EEZ, and continental shelf should remain the same, should not become international high seas as such, should be an area where the resources remain with the countries before that. So this is some of the thinking that some crazy idea that I have that maybe AIS could have a look at it. And the issue of creating a permanent baseline for countries who may not be completely eradicated, completely submerged, like Indonesia, for instance. So I think there is a way to do it, in my view, not by creating a permanent baseline, because we all know that there's a country that has a baseline that's in total violations of UNCLOS, a baseline that is way more than 100 nautical miles, and they're not archipelagic state, for instance, and they are actually a continental state. Um, uh, Using Article 11 of the ports, and this I think need to be put into the nationally determined commitment, the NDC of different countries. So if you have a way to create a connection to the previous base point by creating sort of a harbor works or linkage physically, then I think that should be also one part that we can work on in terms of thinking what would be international law on that part. So how to do that? I think AIS is the perfect framework. The forum is a perfect framework. I think, in my humble opinion, AIS need to develop a very clear position on this. You can engage ILC or the ILA thinkers, and if necessary, you can request advisory opinion of ITLOF and maybe with ICJ. I have We have to look at that, the possibility, and yeah, probably you need to also look at the possibility of having a special session of the United Nations on the rising sea level and the impacts towards the submerging of the whole countries, or river, or moving inward of the baseline of some other archipelagic countries. So I think this is the end of my presentation. This is the proposition that I'm providing to you. So maybe ICE can debate this with, of course, more ideas coming from different parts, from WMO, from Professor Long, from Ronan, from Dr. Schofield, from Park Life, and also a colleague from Fiji, so that this will become a better structured thinking for the eyes to have a look in the future. So once again, thank you very much for the opportunity. So I'm looking forward to hear your take on this particular issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Arya Hafasugroseno, for your presentation. Very thought-provoking, especially on your ideas for new norms for disappearing islands and receding coastlines, and how you would recommend that ICE here would be one of the key institutions that could brought or perhaps discuss those issues further. Thank you very much once again, Ambassador. Before moving to the second panelist, second session, I would like to kindly remind all the attendees, participants, to fill in the form, the attendance form, and you can also start posing your questions on the Q&A box to the speakers. Don't forget to put your name and institution, and also to whom you would like to address your question to. Now, the second session would discuss sea level rise in the case of archipelagic and island countries. And we are very delighted to have Professor Ronan Long and Professor Clive Schofield from the World Maritime University. So they will be jointly presenting their materials. And first, maybe I would like to introduce the speakers first. Professor Ronan Long is the director of the World Maritime University Sasakawa Global Ocean Institute. and he's an expert in the law of the sea, law of climate change, as well as multilateral diplomacy and dispute resolution. Previously, he was with the National University of Ireland Galway, and also was visiting scholar at the Center for Oceans Law and Policy at University of Virginia School of Law. And he has been involved in various research programs relating to the international law of the sea and also ocean governance. So Professor Ronan Long, you will be sharing this session with Professor Clive Schofield. You both have 30 minutes. Please, Professor Ronan Long, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well,
please.
Firstly, I'd like to say good afternoon to all our distinguished participants from the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and a very warm good morning to my dear friend and colleague, Ambassador Havas, as well as those that are joining us from the Caribbean and elsewhere. First and foremost, I would say I really enjoyed the presentation from Ambassador Havas, and I share his views on many of the points made. Clearly, this issue goes very much to the heart of our work in the university. Over half of our students come from Asia and the Pacific. Close to 20% come from Latin America and the Caribbean. So we actually address these issues in the classroom, and of course, it's a very different classroom these days in light of the pandemic. I'm going to make some general remarks to respond to Ambassador Havas on climate change and boundary issues. And I'm going to go back to that report that he referred to, the ILC study, which is very, very significant. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Clive Schofield, and he'll speak about climate change and boundaries in the context of risk assessment, as well as the work that he has undertaken as a member of the ILA Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise. And I think Ambassador Havas made very clear about this close interrelationship with the climate, weather and oceans, both in the context of moderating climate change, but also these impacts that climate change has on oceans and law of the sea. He also referred to the special reports, and this is quite an important milestone for ocean law scholars, because, should we say, the law of the sea has to be based on evidence, and I think I would share his views that the evidence is unequivocal in relation to what has been presented in the 2019 report. So firstly, that the global mean sea levels are rising, and secondly, that they're exacerbating extreme events and coastal hazards. And of course, everybody joining the conversation this afternoon from the Pacific and the Caribbean and Southeast Asia are very much aware of these events. I suppose there are a couple of very important findings in the 2019 report. It's as a result of human impacts. Secondly, it is accelerating. And of course, our distinguished moderator highlighted, shall we say, the benchmarking levels, which in terms of the scope over the next few centuries is in the order of several meters. And of course, the report highlights that there is great global variation, and we saw some great examples of that in Ambassador Havas's photographs. And of course, he referenced, shall we say, the experience in the Pacific and the Caribbean and elsewhere. And of course, we have to keep in context that it's driven by emissions, and of course, global warming itself. We have melting of the polar ice caps. We have the changing on the baselines of the points from which we measure baselines, both the normal baseline in particular, and indeed he made special reference to archipelagic baselines. And of course, it's leading to inundation coastal flooding, erosion, human displacement, and intrusion to groundwaters. Now, I suppose my first point, and I'm going to come back to this, is which, you know, he emphasizes the importance of AIS responding to this particular issue. And I would agree fully in relation to that, because the impacts are more severe for small islands, developing states. They have a lower capacity to adapt. It's exacerbating inequalities, and of course, it's strengthening not only existentialist issues such as the survival of humans on small islands, developing states, but their very existence, as well as issues such as food security. Now, I think the impacts of climate change are exacerbated by some of the issues that were being addressed over the last number of meetings of the AIS forum, particularly issues such as IUU fishing, unsustainable exploitation of the resources of the ocean. And of course, we're seeing the impacts in human terms in relation to forced migration across the world. And of course, the planet cannot sustain any of this. By the way, the Global Risk Report, which is produced by the World Economic Forum every year, ranks climate change and related environmental issues as the top 5 risks in terms of likelihood. And this is the first time, the 2020 report, that one category of risk has occupied all 5 of the top spots in the risk analysis. The risk analysis, of course, was published before the pandemic, and of course we can expect in the next edition of this report to see the pandemic as the major risk. What I would say in relation to the climate change regime is climate change regime is very much science-led, and we made reference to the IPCC report, which has informed this whole process right from 1988. And of course, we had the first assessment, and subsequently with the Framework Convention, a second assessment at Kyoto, third assessment Copenhagen, a fourth assessment Durban, and the fifth assessment the Paris Agreement. So there has been a response to climate science. Now, we can compare and contrast with that with the Oceans Law, that we don't have the same mechanisms in Oceans Law to respond to scientific research. So where are we taking the responses? We're taking the responses in the forms of coastal zone management. We're taking the responses in the context of fisheries management, spatial planning, and obviously enhancing resilience. We saw some really great examples in Ambassador Havis's photographs in relation to that. And of course, now we have to manage the implications for maritime boundaries and baselines. I would argue that there's a great opportunity to address some of the key issues in the context of the BBNJ negotiations, to look at a closer alignment of climate issues in the draft agreement, both the context of principles and approaches, also in relation to area-based management tools, the environmental impact assessment provisions, as well as the fourth stream on capacity building and technology transfer, as well as within the institutional setting. Now, I think it's quite important to do this, because what we see is that despite its importance, oceans and climate change rank at the very bottom of political leaders' top priorities. And I show on the slide data undertaken on the basis of a survey, data demonstrated on the basis of a global leaders survey undertaken by William and Mary University in the United States. The importance
excuse me,
of
Professor
change,
Ronald Long, excuse me.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupt, but we cannot see your share screen. So would you please make sure that
Okay, sorry, I beg
your
your
presentation
pardon.
is shared?
So
It's okay.
you want me, let me see if I can share screen. Oh my goodness.
That's okay.
Have you got it on the screen now?
Yes, we can see it now. So if you could please, yes, good.
Oh, you should, yeah,
Thank you.
okay. I wasn't aware of that. So
That's all right.
yeah, okay. So my point is, right, this is the Global Leaders Study in relation to what are the top priorities, and over 2,000 respondents, 2,435 respondents. Climate action and life below water is at the very bottom of the list, right? Actually, goal 14 is last. Now, if we look at the diagram in the bottom left, we can see, right, that there is a different focus in relation to leaders in East Asia and Pacific. We can see, for example, climate action goal 13 is quite close to is about 35%. So there is awareness in East Asia and Pacific of the importance, far greater awareness that there is perhaps elsewhere in the world, particularly in Africa and indeed in Latin America. And that is borne out as well in relation to the respondents to the ILC study. Okay, some general remarks, and then I want to get on to the ILC study. Firstly, a rapid action is required. We also must learn from the pandemic, right? There's a kind of a pullback from multilateralism. So what is required here is that there's a requirement for regional solutions, or indeed our joint or transnational solutions by regional entities. I think education is a catalyst, and that's why I'm very keen on joining this webinar this morning. I think there's an opportunity to build resilience. And of course, Professor Schofield will turn to the risk analysis. I'd like to, maybe in my closing slides, to come back to the ILC report, which Ambassador Havas referred to. And the first point, I think, which was struck me about the report is this emphasis that this issue wasn't addressed at the third conference because they weren't aware of climate change. And shall we say, the ambulatory nature of baselines was a kind of a creature of its era. There are exceptions to this, particularly in relation to continental shelf limits, in relation to Article 76, which are fixed on the basis of a recommendation by the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. And then we have specific provisions in relation to deltas. Now, I think there's a very important point emphasized in the report, which is ambulatory baselines do not respond to the concerns of states who are affected by sea level rise, and that there's a corresponding necessity to adopt a approach which adequately addresses the preservation of baselines and the outer limits of maritime zones, as well as the entitlements. And I think that gets to the key issues addressed by Havas. Now, there's a very practical suggestion in the ILC study, which is that once you deposit notifications, and by the way, the legal requirement for the deposition relates only to straight baselines, but there's nothing stopping states to deposit the limits are based on normal baselines or indeed archipelagic baselines, and then to stop updating these notifications in order to preserve their entitlements. Now, something very important, and again, I would emphasize, Ambassador Havas addressed this, is very interesting in the context of the submissions for the ILC study, is there were very few respondents, if any, from Africa or Latin America, or indeed Europe. So there's an issue, right, in relation to understanding state practice over and above the practice highlighted by Ambassador Havas and indeed that my colleague Clive Schofield. But what is evident from the existing state practice that we have in Pacific, Asian, and to some extent in North American regions is there is a body of state practice under development, particularly in relation to the freezing issue highlighted by Ambassador Havas, as well as the physical protection of the coast. By the way, in countries such as the Netherlands, this has always been the norm, where they physically protect the coast. Now, an important point in relation to the ILC study is that they had a determination that it was too early to draw a definitive conclusion about the emergence of a customary rule. And the reason for that doesn't relate to the amount of state practice, but it refers to the existence of opinion juris. That is to say, the belief of states that this practice is legally binding. So that element is missing. And a key aspect of this, which goes directly to what Ambassador Havas said, is the need for states to make submissions to the ILC. And I think that's a key issue flagged in his presentation. State practice generally supports preservation of existing maritime delimitations, and we have very clear rules in that. And again, in relation to the emergence of a customary rule, there was evidence of state practice, but the absence of opinion juris. And in relation to islands, the status of islands that disappear, the study found that the best option would be the preservation of maritime entitlements, and likewise in the existence of, shall we say, human habitation on islands where the islands would be, in the eyes of the law, reduced to the status of a rock. Again, there was an emphasis on the preservation of the existing balances of coastal and third states' rights in respect to those features. I found the ILC report study very compelling, and I think it very much fits with Ambassador Havas, who has spoken on this issue for a number of years. He led out in a conference at the university with Berkeley Law that we held a number of years back, and we've published on that. We were also publishing on biodiversity, and he spoke last year on that issue, and in the context of the bigger and wider issues for archipelagic and small island states. And I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I would like to hand the mic over to my colleague, Professor Schofield.
Thank you very much indeed, Ronan. And I'll just try and share my own screen. There we go. And I should probably pause to say to our moderator, Pagos, but did you want to say a word before I continue?
Yes, maybe just to introduce you a little bit, Professor. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Ronan Long, for the presentation. Next speaker would be Professor Clive Schofield. He is the head of research at the World Maritime University, Sasakawa Global Ocean University. Please, Professor Clive Schofield, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Guzman. Can you see my full screen?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Excellencies, distinguished participants. It's a great pleasure to present as part of the Archipelagic and Island States Forum webinar today. Pardon me. What I'd like to do in this presentation is very swiftly touch on some of the impacts and risk factors for both island and archipelagic states in terms of their coastlines, baselines, delineation of outer limits, and delimitation of maritime boundaries. Some of the response options in play, the emerging practice, which we've touched on already to some extent, and the work of the International Law Association, particularly the ILA committees on baselines, but also the committee which I'm part of, which is International Law and Sea Level Rise. Now, fundamentally, what we're dealing with is an issue to do with coastal change, and coastal change in response to changing sea level. And in international law of the sea terms, our default scenario for baselines along the coast, which essentially provide for the limit of sovereignty over land territory and the starting line, if you will, for measuring most claims to maritime jurisdiction offshore, is the normal baseline defined as the low water line along the coast as marked on large-scale charts officially recognized by the coastal state. Now, a couple of key considerations here. Even though sea level rise and global climate change was not truly taken into account when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was being drafted in the 1970s and early 1980s, still we have always been aware that coastlines are dynamic features of the landscape or seascape. They change location over time. So the traditional view of normal baselines was that the normal baseline, the low water line along the coast, was ambulatory, i.e. as the coastline moves, so the low water line moves, and therefore the normal baseline, and ultimately the outer limits of maritime claims measured from that normal basin can also shift and change over time. That is substantially exacerbated by sea level rise impacts, although it's a complex issue with many factors feeding into the predictive matrix of sea level rise. But that has necessarily implications for the extent of claims to maritime jurisdiction, potentially for the status of and habitability of particular insular features, and potentially for the delimitation of maritime boundaries. I say potentially because the provisions on maritime delimitation within the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea are somewhat flexible. They merely call for states to reach an equitable solution without providing a methodology. But nonetheless, by far the most popular method of delimitation has been equidistance based. And in order to robustly discern or delimit an equidistance line, one needs to know the location of the baselines along the coast. So baselines are still critical. Fundamentally, this is our concern, that as we have rising sea levels, so we will have inundation of the coast. Therefore, we will see a recession in the location landwards, as it were, of the baseline. Also potentially lose substantial areas of valuable coastal space, which we tend to inhabit, tend to have a concentration of infrastructure where our global mega cities are located. And the seaward impact will also be felt in terms of a retraction in the outer limits of maritime claims, therefore a loss of maritime jurisdiction and rights over valuable marine resources within those spaces. Now, a couple of caveats on this. One tends to see in the literature, particularly in the media, you will find articles which will indicate that 1 meter of sea level rise will equal however many million people displaced, for instance, however much area inundated. We need to be aware of the concept of relative sea level. What is most important to the inhabitants of coasts is the sea level that is experienced at the coast. Coastlines, as morphological, geomorphological features, respond and change with changing sea level. There are complex feedbacks between the shape or morphology of the coastline itself and the sea level. Therefore, if one wants to predict the impacts of changing sea level on the coast, you need to look at the specifics of that particular stretch of coastline, which makes these broad predictions rather suspect. The message I'd say to you is that the sea level does not rise in a manner of simply marching up the contours. It's a more complex equation than that, particularly when you throw in the issue of particular coastal ecosystems, such as coral reefs and mangroves, which have proven to be able to autonomously adapt to changing sea level. Now, there are uncertainties here, for example, with regard to coral reefs, concerning the ability of corals to, as it were, keep growing and keep up with rising sea level when sea level rise is accelerating. And also we have a warmer and more acidic ocean, and therefore one that is less healthy from the point of view of the coral. So we are compromising the ability of these coastal ecosystems to actually keep up with these changes. Similarly, because of the phenomenon of coastal squeeze, we are compromising the ability of coastal ecosystems such as mangroves and other coastal ecosystems to actually adapt and change in situ, because we're undermining their ability to adapt. Now, in terms of the extent of maritime jurisdiction, states generally try and maximize their maritime claims through what is known as the envelope of arcs, of delineating the outer limits of maritime claims, and that could be a 12 or a 200 nautical mile territorial sea or exclusive economic zone. And we may see a deposition along the coastline, leading to an extension of maritime limits. But our fundamental concern in the context of sea level rise is a recession in the location of the normal baselines along the coast, and therefore an impact to landward and also in terms of reduced maritime zones. The caveats here are that by no means all of the baseline is, as it were, created equal. It's the outermost parts, the promontories on your coastline, that provide the key critical base points that generate the outer limits. And you also geometrically require fewer critical base points to control the broader maritime zones. So to some extent, the broader maritime claims, such as the exclusive economic zone with a 200 nautical mile limit, are dependent on less critical base points and therefore potentially less vulnerable. In terms of impacts on islands, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, features which are above water at a high tide are covered by Article 121. They're classified as islands or the subcategory of island. The rock features which are covered at high tide but uncovered at low tide or low tide elevations, with the limited capacity to be used as base points for generating maritime claims, and features that are permanently underwater at low tide are classified simply as part of the seabed. With a rising sea level, the potential is for features to be necessarily reclassified from islands or rocks to potentially low tide elevations, and low tide elevations reclassified as subsurface features. But an added dimension to that is that even if features are not inundated, there is the issue of them becoming increasingly or less and less habitable, and that has potential implications for the breadth of maritime claims that can be generated from them. In terms of archipelagic states, the rules for drawing archipelagic baselines are fairly robust in terms of the length limitations on particular baseline segments, but also critically, as Pahavas mentioned, the ratio test. There is an objective test whereby archipelagic states must capture as much water as their land territory and up to 9 times as much ocean space as land territory. And from the outermost rocks and reefs of the archipelago can then generate the suite of maritime claims. And here I should give a shout out to acknowledge my Indonesian colleague, Dr. Aimade Andi Asana at Gajah Mada University for his assistance on our collaborations on these animations. And there we have a completion of that. Now, for archipelagic states, using the outermost rocks and reefs means that archipelagic states tend to be using the more vulnerable, smaller features that may not be persistent over time, particularly in the context of sea level rise. So a study I've been working on with Professor David Freestone is to look at the vulnerability of archipelagic states and their archipelagic baseline systems in the context of sea level rise. And that study is about to come out in Ocean Yearbook, volume 35, which is the current one underway, which will be out early next year. And the key conclusion there is that all of the archipelagic states have some problems or issues or risks in relation to their baseline systems. one of the key concerns in that context is for those states which have ratios which are close to the limits. Either they're on the verge of capturing too much water, as opposed to land, up to the 9:1 ratio, or they're at the other end of the scale, if you will, and are only capturing a little bit over their land territory area in terms of their maritime space within archipelagic baselines as archipelagic waters. Now, our response options, very briefly, probably the easiest option in one way is to allow the coastline to find a new natural equilibrium, but it's not an easy option in terms of the people living on the coast, or politically. It's an unpalatable option simply to, as it were, do nothing. Our instinct traditionally has been to defend coastline that is subject to erosion, that is under threat. But those sea defenses, particularly hard sea defenses, trying to fix the position of the coastline in place, do have well-known negative knock-on effects environmentally for other parts of the coastline. Most usually, by fixing one part of the coastline, there is a tendency to starve other parts along the coast, as it were, form of the sediment that they require also to remain stable. Some states are advancing into the sea. The Netherlands is a traditional example of this. I draw your attention to Singapore as an island state that has grown by about 25% in area over the last 3 decades. And of course, this is a feasible option so long as the real estate price is high enough. These are extremely expensive options to undertake, but some of the options that may be under consideration to either elevate existing territory or to reclaim from the sea. But I would urge consideration of ecosystem-based adaptation options also. And some of those were highlighted by Pahavas a moment ago. In legal terms, we touched very briefly on the issues of fixing the baseline or fixing the limits, and I'll illustrate that again with animations in a moment. But we need to be wary of some of the pros and cons associated with that, and that's some of the debate that has been going on at the ILA. So one option would be to freeze the baselines, as it were. And if we do so, we have internal waters on the landward side of those baselines or land territory itself, and generate our territorial sea and exclusive economic zone limits. And then we have a rising sea level, but the baseline remains fixed. You then have a broad area of internal waters and a detachment between the actual location of the coastline and the baseline. Now, one of the fundamental tenets of the law of the sea, which was enshrined in the 1969 North Sea continental shelf cases, is that the land dominates the sea. You need land, coastal land territory, in order to generate maritime claims offshore. The potential or the criticism of this kind of option would be, well, this is breaking that rule and is, in a sense, divorcing the land from the sea. So the land under this scenario arguably would no longer dominate the sea. Alternatively, one can fix limits. For example, we could fix the territorial sea limit, but there we would run into the issue that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is very specific on the breadth of maritime claims. So fixing limits, you would end up with a broader than 12 nautical mile territorial sea, or alternatively a broader than 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which is a clear contravention of the respective articles of the convention. However, as Pahavas touched upon, we have emerging, or indeed emerged, state practice, particularly in the Pacific region, whereby states are declaring and essentially fixing their baselines, limits, and boundaries. Now, I draw particular attention to the Marshall Islands Declaration because although the legislation itself is only a few pages long, the accompanying declaration is 451 pages long. Essentially, it provides coordinates for all baselines, limits, and boundaries. So it is a geographical information systems file essentially turned into text. And this is the trend that is occurring, particularly in the Pacific. The light blue shaded jurisdictions are those where the baselines, limits, and boundaries of these states have been deposited with the UN Secretary General through the Division of Ocean Affairs and the Law of the Sea in an apparent attempt to, as it were, fix a line in the water for these states. Finally, very briefly, the ILA Committee on International Law and Sea Level Rise. The mandate here was to look at the possible impacts of sea level rise, the implications for international law of the partial or complete loss or inundation of state territory, and also to develop proposals for the progressive development of international law. In 2018, the proposals of the committee were adopted by the International Law Association in a resolution where, on the grounds of legal certainty and stability, the baselines and outer limits of maritime zones of coastal and archipelagic states, if they are properly determined in line with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which may to some extent meet the concern perhaps mentioned regarding excessive baselines, those should not be required to be recalculated on the basis of sea level change affecting the geographical reality of the coastline. And now, as my good colleague, Professor Ronan Long mentioned, the ILC has issued an encouraging report from the study group on sea level rise. So there are legal developments ongoing, and I think there is a very hopeful trend in the thinking of the ILA and the ILC towards the ability to preserve entitlements for island and archipelagic states. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Clive Schofield. So I think from this second session, we have much more information and broader perspectives on how the current international law sits on the issue of sea level rise and climate change. I got a message from Professor Ronan Long. Professor, you have a few comments before we move on to the
speaker, thank you very much,
yes,
distinguished moderator, and of course, apologize for not sharing my slides. But I want to respond to Ambassador Havis's provocation in ways. I don't think it's a fair assertion to say these are crazy ideas. First and foremost, these are crucial considerations that weren't considered when the treaty was drafted, the parent convention itself. And of course, that's a very important source of international law, but of equal importance is state practice. And we're seeing emerging state practice. I think all three speakers are on this afternoon session are very much of the view that there should be no loss of entitlements. And that's, you know, in terms of when you're thinking about normative developments, ultimately you should say, well, where do you want to get to? And there's a whole reason, shall we say, there are a whole range of reasons to support that. I also liked the idea of an advisory opinion because there's an absence of clarity, or shall we say, certain provisions are open to interpretation in the convention. I also liked his suggestion about this convergence of maybe climate solutions in relation to the NDCs running in parallel with ultimately what has to be a law of the sea solution. So it's not unique to one area of public international law. And by the way, there's a very important human rights element to all of this, which we haven't addressed this morning. One of the things I would say is if you look at the submission of the United States to the ILC, they put quite a lot of emphasis on permanent works, and they have a review body in the United States to review baselines. And if you have permanent works, which, by the way, a permanent works solutions isn't tenable for small island states or for archipelagic states. And in terms of a special session of the United Nations, I would fully concur in terms of its importance. This is a huge global extensionist threat, and it's one where state practice is rapidly overtaking our kind of normative basis. So there's a real risk there for international law that we have an absence of clarity and certainty in relation to what the position is in international law, and it's highlighted in this report, not so much in relation to the state practice itself that we're seeing in Pacific and elsewhere, but the opinion juris, which is the belief that this practice is binding as legal norms. So it's that element that's missing at the moment. So yeah, I would fully concur with what has been presented this morning. Thank you, and again, I do apologize for missing out on some of my slides.
That's all right, Professor. Thank you very much. We still have more time on the question and answer sessions later on. So if you would like to discuss further on that, you are very welcome. Now, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all participants, now we move to the third speaker, and now we are going to discuss and hear about the perspective of one country that has experienced these impacts on sea level rise. So for that, I would like to welcome Mr. Finil Narayan. He is the acting head for climate change and international cooperation from the Ministry of Economy of Fiji. He is actually accompanied by Mr. Kushal Raj, but Mr. Finil will be doing the presentation for today. So Mr. Finil Narayan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to join you all for this esteemed forum discussions. Much has been said by the previous speakers and very enlightening discussions per se, but I just wanted, before I start, I just wanted to see if you can see my screen or my slide. Yeah. All right. Excellent.
Yes, please go ahead.
Great.
Thank you.
Yep. So, like I said, much has been said by the esteemed and distinguished speakers, and what I would like to do is very much try to link Fiji's experiences with adapting to sea level rise, with maritime boundaries in Fiji as well, and the issues that have been discussed so well by the speakers. My presentation per se will be in 4 parts. The first will, of course, be discussing the science and the science on which Fiji's climate policies and ambitions are based upon. And the second part will discuss on sea level rise and the linkage with human mobility and the whole issue of what Fiji is facing with regards to relocation of communities due to sea level rise. The third part will discuss sea level rise and policy interventions we are taking. And the fourth part will discuss sea level rise and the legislative interventions we are taking, particularly how our National Climate Change Bill is actually recognizing the loss of maritime boundaries due to sea level rise. And lastly, something that is very close to my heart is the link between sea level rise and mobilizing finance for adaptation. So let me begin by saying that that sea level rise, or rather the Pacific Sea Level and Geodetic Monitoring Station, which is operated through the support of the Australian government, confirms that sea level rise in Fiji is increasing at a rate of about 3.5 millimeters per year, rather between 3.5 to 4.7 millimeters per year. And this actually is expected to have substantial impact on Fiji's coastal communities. This, of course, is the case with most small island developing states. And I would like to highlight an interesting fact that I came across while my team and I were researching this topic for this presentation, interestingly, we found out that 27% of Fiji's population live within 1 kilometer of the shoreline, and 79% live within 5 kilometers. Now, in the Pacific, including PNG and 22 sovereign states and territories, that number actually increases to 57% of the population living within 1 kilometer of the shoreline, and 79% within just 5 kilometers of the shoreline. So sea level rise is actually a fundamental and existential threat to small island developing states, as aptly outlined by Professor Ronan. Having said that, um, the international, or rather the IPCC reports, particularly the 1.5 degree report that had come out, very much highlights the fact that the science is pointing towards a bleak future for small island developing states. In particular, annual temperatures and extreme daily temperatures are projected to increase with high confidence. Model projections indicate an increase in rainfall during the months of November to April, which is actually this cyclone season for Fiji and most other small island developing states. So basically, our wet seasons will become wetter, and in addition to sea level rise, coastal inundation, as well as waterways flooding, etc., would become an increasing event, contributing to high risks of flooding. Lastly, ocean acidification is expected to continue to increase with very high confidence. This is a worrying trend for small island developing states who are so intrinsically linked to the ocean with regards to livelihoods and culture and so on and so forth. Coral bleaching as well is expected to increase, and that is not a good news for small island developing states whose fundamental foreign income earning is tourism, and tourism dependent on the pristinity of our nature. And of course, this is a fundamental threat, or rather climate change and coral bleaching, also ocean acidification, is a fundamental threat to our economic stability as well. Sea level rise. This is perhaps the most important and pertinent part of this discussion. Is expected to rise with very high confidence, and I've already mentioned that we have recorded increases in about 4.7 millimeters in sea level rise over the past few decades in the Pacific alone. Now, having said that, I will go on to perhaps state the obvious, and the fact is that climate change will restrict the number and rather the number and efficiency of future possible adaptation measures for infrastructure. For instance, sea level rise will increase water tables, consequently affecting in-ground septic and sewer pumping stations in small island developing states, particularly in island atolls. In addition to that, groundwater will be contaminated by saltwater intrusion, restricting potential for future usage. Furthermore, the erosion of shorelines and the destruction of buildings and infrastructure is expected to be a serious issue that we would be grappling with, in addition to those that you are seeing on the screen at the moment. This, of course, is a major burden to our development aspirations, particularly in the long run, as we are entering the decade for action for SDGs as well as the Paris Agreement. These issues are yet to be addressed, or rather addressed in a manner that is expected to help overcome small island developing states and the development challenges that they face. So, having said that, let me go on to the second part of my presentation, which talks about sea level rise and human mobility, and how actually small island developing states, particularly Fiji and the Pacific, are grappling with the fact that sea level rise is significantly impacting the security, the stability, the livelihoods, the culture, the customs, and the traditions of our people. So human mobility in Fiji, migration, displacement, and planned relocation are becoming common terms that we are now having to incorporate within our development agenda, as sea level rise continues to be a fundamental detriment to our development aspirations, particularly for low-lying coastal communities. We are having to allocate increasing amount of resources to ensure that either these communities are protected through built infrastructure and nature-based solutions, or they are relocated and migrated or displaced. So Having said that, Fiji's displacement risk is highest during storm surges, and sea level rise, of course, contributes to that, and that in itself is not good news for Fiji when we say that the adversities of climate change is expected to increase many folds. Um, Interesting facts that I wanted to highlight was that 5,800 people are likely to be displaced at any given year in the future, as and when we are affected or impacted by climate adversities. And sea level rise is of course one of them. Disasters have triggered, or rather natural disasters have triggered around 153,000 displacements since the International Displacement Migration Commission started to collect data on disasters. And this 153,000 number is for Fiji alone, and majority is triggered by cyclones and storm surges that are contributed by sea level rise. Of course, 40% of this number that I have just quoted is attributed to Tropical Cyclone Winston, the single largest cyclone to hit the Southern Hemisphere in 2016, which had a direct impact on Fiji. Of course, the cost of human mobility is extremely high to bear for small island developing states like Fiji. Some numbers that have been quoted um, in upwards of $1 million Fijian dollars, or rather 500,000 US dollars to relocate a small community from point A to point B to be able to negate the impacts of sea level rise. So of course, this is a major problem for Fiji. But what I would like to highlight or discuss, or rather be able to present to this forum, is the fact that Fiji has already relocated 4 communities in around the 2 main islands of Fiji. The first being in Denimano village in Bua. The next is in Vunudungloa village in Takandrove, Vunisavisavi village in Takandrove as well, and Tukaraki village in Ba. A majority of them have been funded by the Fijian government and one by the European Union. There's an ongoing relocation of another community in Narikoso as well because of sea level rise. And this, of course, is a fundamental challenge that would continue to would continue, or rather demand to be addressed by the Fijian government as and when sea level rise starts to become an increasing problem in the very near future. The next part of my presentation very quickly discusses about sea level rise and policy interventions. And this is where I would like to highlight the actions and the strategic actions that we are taking, particularly from the Fijian government's end, to address sea level rise and the challenges we face. On the screen is basically a policy map for Fiji's climate change actions and ambitions. We begin with our 5-year and 20-year national development plan, which basically is an overarching outline of how and what we want to be in the next 5 to 20 years in terms of our development aspirations. That is guided by our national climate change policy, which then gives guidance to our national adaptation plan, our mitigation plans, our ocean plans, as well as our finance for climate change. And of course, this is ultimately supported by the climate change bill, which is currently under review and going through second round of consultations. So the policies that are highlighted red are the ones that I will be discussing later on in this presentation, and it's very much related to the issue of sea level rise, adapting to sea level rise, and ultimately maritime boundaries. Now, very quickly, to address human mobility guidelines, Fiji has come up with 2 trailblazing policies. The first is the planned relocation guideline, which basically helps the Fijian government be able to relocate vulnerable communities, low-lying communities, in a systematic and planned manner before disaster hits in a proactive manner. And the second is the displacement guidelines, which helps the Fijian government guide and relocate communities after natural disasters and sudden impacts of climate change, where communities are not actually planning to move, but they are forced to move. So these are the overarching policy guidelines that are actually feeding into our work in addressing sea level rise, as well as addressing the issues related to maritime boundaries, which our climate change bill further goes on to address, and I will talk about that in later slides. Now, with regards to supporting our planned relocation guidelines and creating a solid framework for addressing human mobility and displacement in Fiji. We are supporting our planned relocation guidelines with 2 additional documents called the Comprehensive Risk Assessment and Vulnerability Assessment Framework, as well as standard operating procedures for relocating communities. Now, standing operating procedures are expected to be step-by-step guidance that would be given to, or rather that would be used by the Fijian government to help relocate communities in a systematic, planned, and holistic manner. And the Comprehensive Risk and Vulnerability Assessment Framework is expected to help the Fijian government be able to proactively identify communities that are vulnerable to climate change, vulnerable to sea level rise, in a more systematic and strategic manner, so that we are able to plan and allocate resources in the future. So these are the trifecta policies that we have developed and will be the fundamental foundations for us in Fiji to address sea level rise. I'm pleased to announce that these policies are actually now being replicated through IOM, International Organization of Migration, rather, in the Pacific. So this is actually being replicated in for the Pacific as a whole. So we are very proud to say that this is a best practice that is being replicated in the region. Now, this is where my presentation links up with discussions that have been had so far with regards to maritime boundaries and how actually Fiji is trying to address sea level rise through legislative interventions. Now, the climate change bill, which I had mentioned, touches on relocation and displacement, and dare I say is a trailblazing initiative for the Pacific, because it is the first legislation of its kind that would be addressing a holistic spectrum of climate change issues, be it from mitigation to adaptation to loss and damage, as well as to sea level rise in oceans and so on and so forth. So it's a very comprehensive bill that is mirrored to the Paris Agreement. So the draft climate change bill aims to provide a comprehensive, my apologies, let me just try and, okay. Yeah, so the climate change bill aims to provide a comprehensive framework to guide our response to climate change. The bill establishes the Fiji Relocation Task Force and relocation of displacement communities on the impacts of climate change, which of course feeds into the work of Fiji's legislations on sea level rise. In addition to that, and actually I would like to skip to the last point, which is that the draft bill actually recognizes the loss of maritime boundaries due to sea level rise. So the upcoming climate change bill gives permanence to Fiji's maritime boundaries in the face of climate change and sea level rise, and will continue to advocate such progress. The bill sets out or rather Fiji's intention to retain our sovereign right over our existing maritime boundaries, irrespective of future impacts of sea level rise. This is important as EEZs are defined under international law as 200 nautical miles from the last point of land, which I do not need to explain further and has been explained very well by the speakers before me. As a Pacific small island state on the front lines of sea level rise and being adversely affected by coastal erosion, Fiji is trying to assert its position through this bill that our boundaries will remain fixed, and that our sovereignty and the boundaries within which we exercise our sovereign rights will not be affected by these changes. So in fact, it is one of the very first bills for Fiji, in effect, in the region that is actually placing or linking climate change and sea level rise in a very strong and holistic manner at the national level. So we will definitely be wanting to showcase and highlight this through this forum, as well as in upcoming conversations regarding UNCLOS and so on and so forth. This, of course, this slide just goes on to explain how the climate change bill will actually give more recognition to the relocation task force in Fiji, and how the relocation task force will actually help enforce Fiji's advocacy on sea level rise and loss of maritime displacement. So I will not go into this in detail. I'm sure the Secretariat will circulate this presentation later. I would like to go on to the last part of my presentation, which is linking sea level rise and finance, and whatever I have just said with regards to how Fiji needs to address the adversities of sea level rise and link that to our adaptation efforts to climate change. The fundamental the fundamental need is finance, to mobilize finance at an adequate scale. And of course, how are we doing that is what I want to discuss right now. So I would like to highlight the fact that Fiji's Climate Relocation and Displaced People's Trust Fund is something that we have set up to help show up finance to help people in Fiji who are affected by sea level rise. So the fund itself supports the relocation of displaced people. It also helps to support the relocation of critical infrastructure like schools and hospitals. It is also a national effort to avert loss and damage, and of course, protect and preserve the culture, community, and tradition, livelihoods of our people in the face of rising sea levels. How will this fund be, or rather, what will this fund do? It will first and foremost, it will help to create a research space for undertaking studies into the circumstances and necessities for planned relocation and the impacts on sea level rise or other impacts caused by sea level rise. It will also investigate activities and initiatives that assesses the vulnerability of communities which may be at risk of displacement due to climate change and sea level rise. It also will focus on mobilizing activities and initiatives that identify viable locations where communities can be relocated when they are faced with displacement and relocation. And of course, lastly, it will undertake activities and initiatives which seek to ensure that relocated communities are provided the necessary infrastructure to guarantee adequate standard of living, rights, human rights, climate justice in general. Lastly, the last slide talks about how this fund will be capitalized. And of course, we plan to do so with policy-based taxation mechanisms, particularly something called the Environment and Climate Adaptation Levy, which is a consortium of taxes on luxury goods, plastic bags, super yachts, people earning more than $270,000 or more, so on and so forth. It's a consortium of taxes that we would like to put into this fund and capitalize and seed capitalize it. 3% of this particular fund called ECAL would go into the relocation of communities trust fund. At the moment, we are developing mechanisms, modalities that would be safeguards for this trust fund, and hopefully we could use that to leverage international and bilateral contributions to help us combat sea level rise and of course build adaptation resilience at the community level. So that is the end of my presentation. I would love to hear comments and feedbacks and reactions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fineo Narayan. It is really interesting to see how this issue of sea level rise and climate change has adequately been addressed in Fiji with the specific policy interventions, financial mechanism that you just presented. I think it is really interesting. Thank you very much again for your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, it's time for a discussion, for a Q&A session. So please, if you have any questions, you can just write them in the Q&A box with the format, name, institutions, and to whom your question is addressed to. And then, of course, type the questions there. While we're waiting for the questions from the participants. I understand that Mr. Fineo Narayan is already really late in Fiji. It's almost 10 o'clock at night. So I would like to invite other speakers, other panelists, either Ambassador Hafaz, Professor Ronan, or Professor Clive. If you have any questions or comments on Mr. Fineo's presentation regarding the Fiji's policy in addressing sea level rise and climate change, you may have the floor.
Pak Guzman, if I would like
Yes,
to share what we have done in terms of financing to our colleague from Fiji. So Indonesia has established a new institution under the Ministry of Finance, and it's called the National Agency for Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Fund. So normally when we talk about financing of climate adaptation and mitigations, the money would come from the state budget, right? And the state budget will go to relevant ministries and relevant projects, and then it will be disbursed over there. And the money will come from different sources, forced taxation, national income, and also international donors. Now, the problem with this approach is that it takes a long time, and sometimes the project is not specifically geared towards climate change as such. So that's why the Ministry of Finance is establishing this national institution, this national agency. It just came up last year, and the idea is to get funding from state-owned budget and also from the market. Now, from the market, we have launched green bond and green sukuk, and we have done 3 exercises. I was involved in the green sukuk, Islamic financing, green Islamic financing, when colleague from the Ministry of Finance from Indonesia came to Frankfurt, and we pitched before investors. And we managed to get 2.3 billion US dollars, and it's basically oversubscribed. I think this is a new model. I think you're aware also, Dr. Finel, that Seychelles is doing blue bond, I think. So we are looking at that possibility because we only have green bond, which is terrestrial, not so much oceanic based activities, but we're looking at that. But the model, I think, is something that we could also look and share. And the trust fund that you establish is a very good idea. It's a very smart idea, I would say, because then you can have the trust fund funding being managed professionally, and the annual income of the trust fund from the rates of interest rate can also be used for different projects. So what we do with this new agency is we are also building a trust fund like yours, but to expand the financing, we embrace the market directly. So we are going to launch again SDG bonds coming up, I think early next year or the end of this year. And normally we do the pitching in Hong Kong, Dubai, and London, Luxembourg, and Frankfurt. These are basically the places where the investors are, and this way we are pitching for this green bond. So I think this new development is something that countries could have a look, in terms of adaptation of climate change. Thank you. There is also questions in the chat. I just want to touch as well about the legal questions that we should submit if you want to have advisory opinion to ITLOS. I think the issue of the clarity of the legal stability vis-a-vis our baseline is very important. So I think these are the things that the legal issue that we can raise there. And of course, from the discussion that emerged from the ILA, from the ILC, and also from the state practice, we can also conclude that there is a very strong need for legal clarity, legal stability of this particular issue. So I think that's the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Hafaz, Pak Dubes. Um, I'm afraid we lost Mr. Vinil Narayan. He's not on the screen, but okay, he's on the screen. Mr. Vinil Narayan, there was this response from Ambassador Hafaz regarding the Indonesian experience. Perhaps you have some comments or feedback on that, please.
Sure. My apologies. I lost connection for a while,
Yeah,
but I
that's
did,
okay.
did manage to get most of what His Excellency had said. I agree with the point that capital markets is something that is more so a growing opportunity for developing states to be able to quickly mobilize finance for climate action. And in fact, to be honest, Fiji is also looking towards mobilizing blue bonds for its ocean ambition. So we are on the verge of finalizing our national oceans policy. And so that would be the last policy after which we want to develop or rather go towards a new mantra of moving away from policy development to policy implementation. And we can only do that through mobilization of finance. And we want to do that by accessing capital markets and blue bonds. I'm very pleased to hear that you are also considering something around that line. Very interesting to hear that the SDG bond is something that you are looking at. I understand that Luxembourg had also recently launched something very similar. So I would definitely be reaching out to you, Ambassador, and trying to see how best Fiji could also walk the same walk that you are doing and be able to issue an SDG bond in the very future as well. So excellent, good to hear that there are innovative approaches to addressing this fundamental issue, particularly around climate adaptation, and happy to work and discuss this further. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you very much. There is this question from the participant. The question is there any problem with the availability for land for relocation as a result of you mentioned this policy about the relocation projects? So is there any issue with the land availability? There's one question here from one participant. Thank you.
Excellent question. In fact, Fiji has a very unique land ownership structure. Almost 87 to 90% of our land is traditionally owned. The remaining, I think 10 to 11% is actually state and private owned. So when we move one community from point A to point B, while there is an abundance of land, there is an issue of cultural conflicts. So a village community needs to go through certain cultures, protocols, mechanisms, etc., before we are able to move them from point A to point B on someone else's land. So a lot of traditional aspects come into play. While land is available, this unique perspective in the Pacific, where culture is also a very dominant issue when it comes to climate change, is something that plays a key role, and that is actually the challenging part for Fiji. So I'll leave it at that, but happy to answer any follow-up questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Vinay. Now we have some questions coming in. I have questions from Ms. Sasya Anindita. It's addressed to Professor Ronan Long and Professor Clive Schofield. The question is, I'll just read it. What do you think about another driver that may affect the maritime boundary, i.e. erosion? Considering the stability of boundary agreements, can we also use the fixed or freezing baseline or fixed outer limits approach and implement it to the national policy without specifying the drivers that may change the baseline? Or would it only be limited for a sea level rise? Professor Ronald Long and Professor Clive Schofield?
Yeah, look, this. I think this is a great question, and okay, the baseline, the normal baseline is the low water line as marked on navigation charts, and it's ambulatory. So erosion accretion, it should move with it, you know. So if you have erosion, you lose. If you have accretion, you gain, and that was shall we say the prima facie position for normal baselines. What's interesting in relation to projection of maritime limits, and Clive will bear this out, is that once the boundaries are fixed, they tend to stay in place. I don't see, for instance, or I don't recall, or to my knowledge, in the ILC report that there is reference to instances where boundaries agreements have been changed subsequently, whether it's as a result of sea level rise or other factors. Quite a few boundary agreements don't specify provisions for amendment, and so that's, I think, an issue. Secondly, my point about this is which Havas kind of referred to there, which is very important, is state practice on straight baselines is entirely inconsistent with the provisions in the convention. There's a whole actual series, limits of the sea, studying state practice across the world in relation to non-compliance. So it seems to be counterintuitive that we have one regime in the law of the sea where we have ignored state practice, and for that reason we can't even say that the provisions in the convention and straight baselines are customary norms, because the practice is so entirely consistent. So one of the issues, I think, is in relation to boundaries by other factors. I think that's a different case. And I think that, you know, I'm not so sure as to what is to be gained in relation to addressing that. Generally, there's quite a lot of practice in developing countries in relation to fortifications or coastal armory solutions. And indeed, as I referred to in my talk this morning, the United States has a whole process to review their baselines, and from time to time, they update them. To my knowledge, and Clive, again, I'm not so sure as to what their practice is in the instance where there's a boundary agreement projected from such baselines. So that's outside of my knowledge. One last point I would say in relation to this is we've talked this morning or this afternoon about an advisory opinion, but it would also be open for contentious proceedings. We discussed that in Singapore maybe 2 years ago at a conference. I think Ambassador Havas led the discussion again that day in relation to solutions. So shall we say there's two routes in terms of international dispute resolution, right? There's the contentious proceedings, and the law of the sea, because of its mandatory and binding nature of its dispute settlement mechanisms, would be a far better way to go in relation to that issue. And we've kind of discussed that at other fora. So yeah, so just to kind of round up on that is that I think we have to be really careful in terms of the sea level and sea level rise as a result of climate change, and to disassociate it from other issues such as accretion or erosion. I don't know if Havas or indeed my distinguished colleague Clive shares my views on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very happy to comment now, if I may.
Yes, please.
On the issue of maritime boundaries and their stability, there is, I think it's fair to say, the norm has been to favor certainty and stability in international maritime boundaries, and indeed international boundaries generally, for the sake of international peace and security. The vast majority of maritime boundaries are defined based on the equidistance method, but actually defined in their location in treaties through a series of geographic coordinates linked by straight lines. Only a very, very few instances simply specify the method without specifying the coordinates. So once the agreements have been freely entered into, they're viewed as being stable and permanent unless the parties to that agreement opt to change the location. And that, again, is not usual. It has occurred in, for example, between Canada and Denmark in the Arctic, where there was uncertainty because of ice cover over the location of baselines. Therefore, there was a provision within the treaty in order to, on the basis of more accurate coastal surveys, to then potentially adjust the line. That's extremely rare. The vast majority of both land and maritime boundaries are considered to be permanent, and in a privileged category of treaty under international law that is immune from quote unquote fundamental change of circumstance under Article 62 from memory of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Now, there is some debate in the literature to suggest that, well, perhaps this only applies to territorial sea delimitations rather than EEZ, because that's sovereignty being divided through territorial sea boundaries, as opposed to sovereign rights under exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. But I don't think that's the majority view. And I think that the ILC study group's report supports that. What I would also draw your attention to is, I think probably the only international case that has directly addressed climate change, sea level rise, and impact on maritime delimitation is the arbitration case between India and Bangladesh, where Bangladesh, having an unstable coastline, raised issues around potential future sea level rise impacts on its baselines, its coastline. And essentially, the tribunal came out with a decision that's essentially argued, we as a tribunal are not interested in historical evidence of where the coastline may have been, and we are not interested in projections as to where the coastline will be in the future. Their role was to delimit a maritime boundary on the location of the coastline now. That type of thinking has pushed many states, and the Pacific again is an excellent example of this, to, in a coordinated, cooperative way, through the Maritime Boundaries Project, to try to reach agreements between themselves and essentially make their maritime jurisdictions at least partially climate proof by fixing their maritime boundaries. And the Pacific region, the Pacific Island states particularly, have moved from a position of about 1/3 of potential maritime boundaries being agreed over the last, since I think about 2010, they've moved now to a situation of the order of 75% agreed. So very substantial progress in a relatively limited amount of time, at least partially driven by the desire to fix permanently those maritime boundary lines.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Ronald Long and Professor Clive Schofield, for your answers. I have two questions here. One is addressed to Ambassador Hafaz. Pak Hafaz, maybe you can also read on the Q&A box. It's a question from Kirana from Pajajaran University. It's regarding your proposal to read for these disappearing landlocked states to still retain their territorial sovereignty on maritime zones and not to turn them into a part of AIS. However, Professor Ronan noted that the preservation of baseline still weighs weak as customary rule since it lacks the opinion juris. So do you think that in order to retain maritime spaces, it will hold a greater emergence if the international community tries to conduct an alternative approach than climate change approach? For instance, the territorial integrity approach. So I think it's regarding your proposal on the issue of how far that the landlocked states can still retain their territorial sovereignty on maritime areas. Please, Pak Hafaz, maybe you would like to answer the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the issue of disappearing island states is a very important issue for the country itself, and also for international law in general. What I was proposing was actually not exactly a territorial sovereignty approach, but more on the approach that the natural resources found in the area that previously was a country as such, and it's a link, of course, with the maritime boundary that has been agreed upon. They belong to the sovereign right. So maybe it's more of the sovereign right instead of a sovereignty of the country itself, because sovereignty, the customary international requires land as a basis to measure it. And I think this is the most difficult part on the issue of the climate change in relation to the disappearing states. Uh, but if you look at the negotiations of Law of the Sea, the third conference in 1960s, for instance, when Indonesia and many other countries claim archipelagic concept or archipelagic approach. If you look at the documents at that time, many countries protested it because international law of the sea at that time did not recognize such thing as archipelagic waters. The international law at that time states basically that country have territorial waters in around their islands, and therefore waters around many Indonesian islands are international waters. That was what the Dutch said, because the Dutch was in conflict with us in different parts of Indonesia. And there was a lot of declassified cable today that countries like the UK, France, Soviet at the time, the US, Australia, were all protesting of these situations of the claim of Indonesia in 1960. And at the same time, also, we have seen a number of countries making claims on the EEZ in this time. So, Law of the Sea negotiations in 1960s that culminated in 1982 addressed many new issues that did not exist before that. So I would take an analogy of that situation today. We did not see it coming. We did not see that what we are doing in land with all these pollutions that we make create the rising of sea level, and basically, the climates and the earth are taking revenge against us, and this is what's happening. And we are looking at losing of territory, losing of nation, country as a new, very foreseeable impact that we are looking at today. So, as I mentioned before, and also mentioned by many colleagues, especially Ronan and Clive, this is something that is being discussed, and we have seen many analyses, we have seen many works from the ILC and ILA, we have seen state practice emerging from the Pacific, and I think it's time a larger group of countries look at this and creates a common positions on that before it goes to the even larger audience at the UN level. So I think this is a lot of hard work to understand what would be the right policy in the future. But I would say the question of legal stability is very important. The issue of the entitlement that countries have had in the past should also be taken into account as a legal principle. Now, to be frank, countries in the Pacific are not the major cause of the pollutions. Other countries, okay, in Europe, in the US, and probably even in Indonesia. So, but these big countries that has a lot of pollutions, they're not having the same impact as in the Pacific. So it is not fair if we keep clinging on the existing or previous law and we are impacting other countries who are not actually causing this kind of pollution. So I think there must be a balance in all of the equation of discussion. It's not going to be easy, but you know, I think we have to be sympathetic to the situation of the country in the Pacific, and try to draw the experience and practices that they are doing, and you know, implement that to different parts of the world. In WMU, as Professor Long mentioned before, you have so many students of archipelagic island states from Africa, Asia, the Pacific, all to the Caribbean. So you know, the concerns are across the world, across the table. And again, if you look very closely, these are island states, small island states. They're not the creator of the pollutions, and they should be living the consequences of other people's doing. So I think this is you know, also a very tricky moral issue in this particular discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Dubes. Okay, I see a hand from Professor Schofield. Yes, Clive, please, you may have the floor. And also Professor Ronan Long, yes.
Thank you very much indeed. And I fully support His Excellency Havasi's proposals there. And I think that the issue of taking the Pacific again as an example of the drive towards delimiting potential maritime boundaries, of declaring baselines, limits and boundaries and depositing that information with the UN Secretary General is a fantastic way to address the issue before them. And it's coordinated, emergent, regional state practice. But the part of the equation that is absent is ensuring that those lines in the sea that are delineated and delimited are actually opposable to other states outside the region. It's those maritime rights that need to be protected, and that requires a broader conversation at the global level, whether an advisory opinion would be a supportive way to proceed, whether there's discussions within the states parties to the Law of the Sea, SPLOS, that is a delightful acronym. That would be, there are multiple different routes towards, in a sense, cementing or concreting in this practice so that it becomes broadly opposable to foreign vessels entering those maritime zones. That's the critical part of the equation that the broader global community needs to come on board with. I have a second thought about the question about, is there enough land? Relatively recently, the leaders of Kiribati, I think Marshall Islands also, and the Maldives are going down this route as well, are essentially saying, we don't want to be climate refugees. We don't want to leave. Instead, we will build up where we are. We'll elevate, we'll construct artificial islands as, in a sense, 3-meter high lifeboats physically for population. So there are heavy engineering routes towards addressing the issue of land-lost states, but they do come with enormous expense and potential environmental harm at the same time. So there are dimensions there to explore in the future, where, because states are certainly already going down this path, and the Maldives in particular has constructed substantial artificial islands which are elevated from the sea high enough to serve as refuges. And so there are these opportunities or potential routes to avoid the land lost situation. Thank you. I'll turn over to my colleague, Professor Long.
Yeah,
yes,
thank you. I'll just maybe add one additional point in this, which is there's a very important call in the ILC report, which is a call to all member states to make submissions on this issue. And by the way, I think the small island developing and archipelagic states are at the front end of the wedge. And but everybody else, sea level rises, and we know this from the science reports, it's going to impact on all countries, coastal countries worldwide. And it's very important that African states and Latin American states and European states present submissions to the ILC, so as we gather sufficient evidence in relation to what the views of states are, as well as their practice. And then it's that element that's that will be required, so as that we can say have a definitive conclusion. And of course, that goes directly to the point that Clive flagged, is the opposability of these particular claims, or how many states are objecting to this development or emergence of regional practice. But I can, dare I say it, right? If we were to come back here 50 years hence, will we see regional practice develop in Europe or in Latin America or indeed in Africa? I think we will. That this issue is something that's not going to go away. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Professor Ronan Long. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, thank you very much, speakers, for all the answers. We are coming to the end of our webinar for today. And before I conclude, I would like to give the opportunities to all speakers to deliver their concluding observations or concluding statements. I would like to start from Mr. Fina Narayan, please. 2 or 3 minutes closing statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guzman. I'll be very quick. Let me begin by saying that the conversation on sea level rise and maritime boundaries is actually picking up really phenomenally in the Pacific, and as rightfully mentioned by Professor Clive, the Pacific is actually taking a concerted approach to addressing this issue. In fact, to quote you exactly, 73% of our maritime boundaries are actually being discussed and negotiated through the Secretariat of the Pacific Community. In fact, Fiji itself is working with 3 other countries to negotiate this. Off the top of my head, I think it's Vanuatu, Tonga, and some other country, I forgot. But again, this issue is very much at the heart of our existence, at the heart of our sovereignty, at the heart of our livelihoods as a nation. And Fiji, for one, would be definitely actively taking a lead role in further discussions, and we hope to take part in one-on-one conversations as well with the panelists and other members of the attendees as and when you see fit. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for allowing us to be having this conversation, and I hope to continue this discussion further in other forums as well. So, Naka, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, next to Professor Clive Schofield. Clive.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a profound honor to be a part of this panel. I've very much enjoyed the conversation, including the crazy parts of it, Ambassador Havas. What I would say as a final thought is we keep coming back to the idea that when the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was being negotiated and drafted, sea level rise was not a pressing concern, or indeed necessarily known to the drafting negotiators. But when those negotiators encountered issues where the coastline was unstable, such as in a delta type situation, they provided provisions whereby stability could be ensured. And that is the driving thought that would suggest that the ambulatory concept of normal baselines in the context of sea level rise would be something which the international community would have fixed if they had known about it. They would have provided the potential for stability and certainty in the interests of international peace and security. That is essentially the goal that's being pursued here. As Professor Long indicated, this is a global situation. It will impact all coastal states. So I'm hopeful that there will be avenues whereby this problem can be addressed on in the law of the sea context. That doesn't necessarily help the people impacted by sea level rise, but there's an element of hope on the legal side that the existing maritime jurisdiction and rights over valuable resources can be retained by threatened states. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Clive Schofield. Professor Ronan Long?
Yeah, thank you very
Yes.
much. And I've enjoyed the conversation this afternoon immensely. It has been this is the hot topic with our students in the university in Malmo. And I'd secondly say that very much it's within the spirit of the convention that there should be no loss of entitlements. And I would also very much endorse the view espoused by my colleague, my distinguished colleague, Clive Schofield, right, that the gain here for the international community is one of stability, security, certainty, and predictability. And I think that goes, very much to if you look beyond the convention itself, and if you look at the preamble, and indeed, if you look at both the contentious and advisory jurisprudence of international courts and tribunals, and since the coming into force of the convention, I think ultimately that's what they're striving to achieve. So I commend those in AIS that can take this issue forward to the international arena. And I would also love to see states in Latin America, Central America, and indeed in Africa, where most of our work is undertaken in relation to a whole range of issues, including food security and human migration, that this is put very much at the top of their agenda as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronan. And finally, Ambassador Hafaz, please.
Thank you, Pak Gusman. I think like many other speakers, I enjoy very much the discussions this morning today. I believe the discussions on the level sea rise has already moved now from academic discussions to the UN, although it's still at the ILC level, already moved to the discussions at the international associations now. And I hope that the discussions in the Archipelagic and Island States Forum can crystallize even further, taking the cue and also taking the experience from the Pacific countries and also the decisions made by Pacific countries, including Fiji. And we hope to replicate that at the global level, because AIS has a coverage at the global level as well. I'm really very much looking forward that this particular issue is being formalized as an agenda at the AIS level, and also the fact that WMO is also having this particular issue discussed on a regular basis with many direct interests of the students, which are officials from different countries. I think the cooperation between AIS and WMO can be continually further in the future on this particular issue, so that we have a really global reach on finally hope having in the future a stability and predictability for the sake of international peace and security. So once again, thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing the colleague officials from the AIS looking at this much more structured with a concrete result that can be seen as an example and the locomotive for discussion of the particular issue at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hafaz, and thank you to all speakers. We may not be able to hear it, but I would like to invite all participants to give a big hand of applause to our wonderful speakers for today. Thank you very much for your presentations and contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, that ends the webinar for today. Again, I would like to thank our speakers for today, Ambassador Arif Hafasugroseno, Professor Ronan Long, Professor Clive Schofield, and Mr. Vinay Narayan, assisted by Mr. Kushal Raj. And I would also like to thank AIS Forum and the UNDP, as well as the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime and Investment Affairs as the organizer for this webinar, and also to all participants for their active participation and also questions. We hope that we can meet again another event, and this discussion will be here for quite some time. So hopefully then we can follow up this forum, and also especially the AIS forum could also take up some of the observations and discussions that we had earlier today. With that, I conclude the webinar. Thank you very much once again to everyone. Have a good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Thank you very much. Stay safe and healthy. Assalamualaikum. Thank you. Bye-bye.
The Archipelagic and Island States Forum is a platform designed to facilitate 47 archipelagic and island nations to collaborate and cooperate in addressing common challenges in 4 thematic areas: climate change mitigation and adaptation, blue economy, marine plastic debris, and good maritime governance. In 2017, the idea to establish the multinational cooperation framework among the archipelagic and island states was first iterated during the UN Ocean Conference in New York. In November 2018, Indonesia hosted the first ministerial meeting with 21 archipelagic and island states. The Archipelagic and Island States Forum was established by Manado Joint Declaration. In the following year, the second ministerial meeting adopted the final outcome with 25 AIS participating countries. To achieve our vision, we focus on 4 objectives, which we translate into our programs. Create an open, innovative, and engaging forum. Provide a space to share and implement innovative and tangible programs. Promote collaborative efforts among stakeholders. And create opportunity through the blue economy. Ideation, implementation, and evaluation are the core elements to our solution framework in addressing the problems. In 2020, AIS Forum launched programs to drive innovation, which are AIS Joint Research, a collaborative applied research program affiliated with academic institutions in AIS countries with various topics related to the 4 areas of collaboration. The Innovator Scholarship Program, a fully funded exchange program for talented individuals from AIS participating countries who can demonstrate exceptional leadership quality and creative mind, and AIS Innovation Challenge, to find innovative ideas and breakthroughs that can help societies and businesses to be more resilient and adaptive during crisis situations. AIS Forum also launched AIS Blue Startup Hub, a platform to connect marine-focused startup in 47 archipelagic and island states across the globe. AIS Blue Startup Hub Mentoring Program was launched with 18 participating startups from 6 countries. As an effort to realize the smart, innovative solutions, AIS Forum also engaged with public audiences through online events in a form of trainings, workshops, talk shows, and discussions with various topics and stakeholders across AIS participating countries. In light of COVID-19 pandemic, it is important for archipelagic and island states to have a resilient economy. Therefore, AIS Forum Secretariat introduces programs which focuses on blue economy. As a form of its commitment, AIS Forum developed Blue Economy Development Index, or BEDI. This index will be used as a tracking tool to determine the current use of coastal and marine resources, and it can be used as a tool to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Blue Financing Framework, or BFF, which provides a guidance for governments, financial institutions, philanthropists, and donors to align their investments with the blue economy principles and allow them to select a project to be financed in the blue economy sectors. Smart and innovative solution programs, such as sharing knowledge sessions with experts and representatives from AIS participating countries. Plankton, which was a competition to raise awareness in reducing marine plastic debris. Impact pitching, which connects startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, potential investors, and growth enablers to gain partnership. And Ending Plastic Pollution Innovation Challenge, which was a collaboration with Marine Plastic Debris Project from UNDP Indonesia to address marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. Many solutions to challenges that affect AIS participating countries in 4 main thematic areas and SDG 14 goals are produced through collaboration programs. These programs will explore opportunities through innovation and experiment that benefits on a local, regional, and international scale through sharing knowledge and experiences between AIS participating countries.